He spent his life trying to stop his father. He ran out of time. Taira no Shigemori was 34 years old when he died, in the year 1179, the year before the war began. He never fought in the Genpei War. He never saw Dan Nura. He never saw his family destroyed. He died too early for any of that, and because he died too early, all of it happened. This is the story of the son who tried to stop Kiyomori, and what it cost him, and what it cost everyone else when he was gone. Taira no Shigemori was Kiyomori's eldest son. He was born in 1138, which placed him in the generation before the Genpei War, the generation that grew up in the years when Kiyomori's ambitions were still in the process of being realized, when the world that would eventually collapse had not yet fully taken the shape that would make its collapse so consequential. He was the heir, not just in the formal sense of the eldest son who would, in the ordinary course of things, inherit his father's position and continue the family's trajectory. He was the heir in the fuller sense, the person in whom the next generation of the family's identity was invested, the person whose own development was understood by everyone around him as the development of what the Taira would become after Kiyomori was gone. This is a specific kind of pressure, the pressure of being the heir, and it operates differently depending on what the person who is being succeeded is actually like. If the person you are inheriting from is someone whose qualities and values and ways of being in the world are qualities you share, the pressure of being the heir is the pressure of a continuity that feels natural, a path that leads in the direction you are already going. If the person you are inheriting from is someone whose qualities and values and ways of being in the world are fundamentally different from your own, the pressure of being the heir is something else entirely. The pressure of being expected to become, and to continue, something that is not quite what you are, a path that leads in a direction that your own nature does not naturally incline toward. Shigemori, as Kiyomori's heir, was in the second situation. Kiyomori, as this series has discussed in many contexts, was a man of extraordinary ambition, a man whose vision of what the Taira could be was larger than anything his predecessors had imagined, and whose willingness to pursue that vision, through political maneuvering and military force and strategic marriage, and the patient, ruthless management of every obstacle that the pursuit of power placed in his path, had actually produced the world that this series has been exploring. He was not a gentleman. He was not a man primarily shaped by the values of the Heian court, by the aesthetic sensibility, and the cultivation of beauty, and the specific kind of refinement that the court had spent centuries developing. He was a warrior who had used the court systems to achieve what warriors, before him, had not achieved, who had taken the tools the court provided and used them with a directness and an ambition that the court itself had not anticipated. This was his genius. This was also, as this series has discussed, the source of the overreach that ultimately produced the conditions for the Taira's fall. Shigemori, growing up in the world Kiyomori was building, absorbed something different from what his father embodied. He absorbed the court, not simply as a strategy, the way Kiyomori had absorbed enough of the court's values to use them for his own purposes, but genuinely, in the way that a person who has grown up inside a civilization's particular values comes to share those values, to find them meaningful, not because they are useful, but because they are true, because they represent an understanding of what matters in human life that the person has, through experience and temperament, and the specific attentiveness that some people bring to everything around them, come to believe. Shigemori believed in the court. He believed in its values, its ceremonies, its poetry, its specific understanding of the relationship between beauty and human dignity. He believed in the emperor's person as something that deserved genuine reverence, not simply tactical management. He believed in the forms of respect and restraint, that the court had developed over centuries for managing the relationships between the powerful forms that existed at their best to prevent the specific kind of overreach that his father was increasingly engaged in. This difference between Kiyomori's relationship to the court and Shigemori's relationship to the court is the central fact of their relationship and the central fact of Shigemori's story. It was not simply a generational difference, not simply the ordinary kind of disagreement between a father who had built something and a son who had grown up inside what the father built and developed a different relationship to it. It was a difference that went to the most fundamental level of what each man believed the Taira were for, what the family's power was meant to accomplish, what obligations came with the position that Kiyomori had worked his entire life to achieve. Kiyomori believed the position was an end in itself, or if it had purposes, those purposes were the continuation and the expansion of Taira power, the maintenance of the family's dominance as the organizing principle of Japanese political life. Shigemori believed the position came with obligations that transcended the family's own interests, obligations to the court, to the emperor, to the structures of Japanese civilization that had been maintained for centuries, precisely because those structures, however imperfect, were what made the specific kind of life that both he and his father valued possible. This disagreement would define the rest of Shigemori's life. To understand Shigemori's story, you have to understand Kiyomori, not as the historical figure this series will eventually devote its own full exploration to, but as the specific father that Shigemori grew up with, the particular presence that shaped Shigemori's sense of what a person could be and what a person should be. Kiyomori, as a father, would have been exactly what he was in every other domain of his life, formidable, driven, entirely himself, a man whose presence in any room changed the quality of the air in that room, who commanded attention without asking for it, who moved through the world with the specific certainty of someone who had decided, very early and very completely, what he was going to do, and had spent every subsequent year doing it. Children who grow up with a parent like this develop, in response to that parent's specific force of character, in one of two directions. They become the same kind of person, absorbing the parent's values, and the parent's drive, and the parent's specific relationship to ambition, carrying forward, in the next generation, the essential qualities that made the parent what they were. Or they become the counterweight, the person who, precisely because they have grown up so close to this specific kind of force, understand it most clearly, see its limitations most acutely, and develop, in response, a set of values that are oriented in part by what that force is not, by what it lacks, by what it fails to account for or to value. Shigemori was this second kind of child. This does not mean that Shigemori did not love his father. The accounts of their relationship suggest something more complicated than simple opposition, more complicated than a son who had simply rejected his father and built himself entirely in opposition to what his father represented. Shigemori loved his father. The records of their interactions, particularly in the moments of crisis that this series will discuss in later parts, suggest a man who was genuinely trying to protect Kiyomori, to prevent his father from doing things that would harm not just the wider world, but the father himself, the family itself, the position that Kiyomori had spent his life building. But Shigemori also saw his father clearly, in a way that love does not always permit, and that this specific love permitted, because Shigemori, growing up beside this specific man, had had enough proximity over enough years to develop an understanding of Kiyomori that went beyond admiration or imitation. He understood what Kiyomori was willing to do that he himself was not willing to do. He understood what Kiyomori valued that he himself did not value in the same way. He understood the specific quality of Kiyomori's relationship to power, the relationship of a man for whom power was not a means to other ends, but something close to an end in itself, a man who experienced the accumulation of power as a form of expression, as the primary way in which his specific genius and his specific will expressed themselves in the world. Shigemori did not share this relationship to power. What Shigemori shared with his father, what made him unmistakably Kiyomori's son, rather than simply a person who happened to share a family name, was the capability, the intelligence, the judgment, the specific quality of mind that could read a complex situation and understand what it meant and what it required, that could navigate the competing claims and the competing personalities and the competing interests of the Heian court without being deceived by any of them. Shigemori had this. He had it in a form that the people around him recognized, that made him, from a relatively young age, a figure whose assessments were taken seriously, whose judgment was sought, whose presence in any council or negotiation changed the quality of what that council or negotiation could accomplish. He had his father's intelligence. He did not have his father's ambition. This combination, the intelligence without the ambition, made Shigemori one of the most significant figures in the Genpei period's political landscape, the person who might have changed the trajectory of events if circumstances had permitted, and who did not change it, because the circumstances did not permit, and because the one force in the world that consistently overrode Shigemori's better judgment was the force of his own father's will. There is a specific dynamic that develops in a family like the Taira, where the head of the family has built the family's position through the specific qualities that distinguish them, between that head and the heir, who has different qualities. The head has succeeded because of who they are. The heir has been formed in part by observing that success, but the heir has also developed, through that observation, an understanding of what the success has cost, what has been sacrificed or ignored or damaged in the pursuit of it, what the world looks like from the perspective of the people who have been on the receiving end of the head's methods. Shigemori's awareness of these costs, of what Kiyomori's methods had cost and were continuing to cost, in terms of the relationships damaged and the obligations ignored and the restraints transgressed, was not simply an intellectual awareness. It was the awareness of someone who had grown up watching the costs accumulate, who had seen, close up, the specific choices that had been made and the specific things that had been set aside in the making of them, and who had concluded, from this extended observation, that the trajectory needed to change, that the family's position and the country's stability both required a different kind of leadership than the one that had built the position in the first place. He was ready to provide that different kind of leadership. He was just not yet in a position to do so, and by the time the circumstances might have allowed it, he would be dead. The difference between Kiyomori and Shigemori was not, at its core, a difference about tactics or strategy, about how to achieve the goals that both men shared, about the best path to the position of power and stability that the Taira needed. It was a difference about what goals were worth having. Kiyomori's goals, as this series has discussed in many contexts, were organized around the accumulation and maintenance of Taira power, the transformation of the family from a warrior clan that controlled military force into something closer to what the Fujiwara had been at the height of their influence, the family that sat at the center of the imperial system and shaped everything that emanated from that center. This goal was clear. It was pursued with extraordinary consistency and extraordinary effectiveness, and it produced extraordinary results. Shigemori's goals were organized around something else, something that is harder to name in the direct way that Kiyomori's goals can be named, because it is not the kind of thing that warrior cultures, or political cultures, or most kinds of cultures typically name as a goal. It was something like rightness. Not rightness in a moralistic sense, not the rightness of a person who believes they have access to absolute standards of correct behavior, and who judges others by those standards, but rightness in the sense that the Heian court's specific civilization had spent centuries cultivating and refining, the understanding that the relationships between people and their rulers, and between rulers and the institutions that give their rule legitimacy, should be governed by principles that transcend the immediate interests of any single party, that there are obligations that exist independently of whether fulfilling them is convenient or advantageous, and that a person of genuine quality recognizes and honors these obligations, even when the recognition and the honoring are costly. For Shigemori, the obligations that mattered most were the obligations to the emperor and to the retired emperor, the obligations that defined the relationship between the warrior class and the court that warrior class served. These obligations were not, in Shigemori's understanding, simply formal requirements, boxes to be checked in the management of political relationships. They were the substance of what it meant for a warrior family to be legitimate, to have a claim on the loyalty and the cooperation of the rest of the country that went beyond the simple fact of military force. A warrior family that served the emperor with genuine loyalty, that maintained the forms of respect and deference that the court required, that understood itself as an instrument of the imperial authority rather than a replacement for it, was a warrior family that had a legitimate claim on its position, that could justify its power by reference to something beyond simply having it. A warrior family that did not, that treated the emperor as a tool and the court as an obstacle, and the obligations of service as inconvenient fictions that existed to be worked around, was a warrior family whose position was ultimately founded on nothing but force, and force, Shigemori understood, was never a sufficient foundation for lasting power. This understanding, the understanding that the Taira's position required legitimacy, and that legitimacy required genuine service, not just the appearance of service, was the thing that most directly put Shigemori in conflict with Kiyomori, because Kiyomori's methods, increasingly as the family's power grew, were the methods of a man who had come to believe that the forms of service could be maintained, while the substance of service was set aside, that the emperor could be managed rather than served, that the court could be controlled rather than honored, that the obligations could be fulfilled in letter while being violated in spirit. Shigemori watched this happening. He watched it with the specific quality of attention, of someone who understood what it meant, who knew that what his father was doing, however effective it might be in the short term, was undermining the very foundation of the position his father had built. And, when the occasions arose, he said so. This was not a comfortable position to occupy. A son who disagrees with his father, in any culture, in any period, faces a specific set of pressures that make the disagreement difficult to sustain. The pressure of loyalty, the pressure of gratitude, the pressure of the accumulated history of the relationship, all the things that a father has been and done for a son that create obligations of a different kind from the obligations Shigemori was trying to honor. In the Taira clan, these pressures were compounded by the clan's internal structure, the authority that Kiyomori held as the clan's head, the way that authority translated into expectations of deference and agreement from the clan's members, including the member who was the formal heir. Shigemori disagreed with his father. He expressed this disagreement, when the occasions required it, in terms that made the disagreement clear. And then he continued, because what else was available to him, to occupy his position within the clan, to fulfill his responsibilities as the heir, to be, as best he could, the person he believed the heir should be, in a situation where the person whose leadership he was going to inherit was making choices that he believed were wrong. The relationship between Kiyomori and Shigemori across these years was not characterized by open hostility. The records do not describe a relationship in which the father and the son were enemies, in which the disagreements between them had hardened into mutual contempt or rejection. What the records describe is something more complicated and, in its way, more poignant, the relationship between a father and a son who loved each other, and who were, nonetheless, oriented toward fundamentally different understandings of what the family's power was for, understandings that would eventually, as the pressure of specific events forced specific choices, produce specific confrontations. Those confrontations were coming. But before they came, this story needs to spend some time inside the world that Shigemori loved, the world that his father had made available to him, the world that his father was, at the same time, in the process of undermining. Shigemori loved the Heian court. This is the simplest way to put what this series has been circling around in the previous parts, and simplicity is appropriate here, because the love was genuine, and it was not complicated by strategic calculation, or by the desire to appear to love it while actually using it. Shigemori loved the court in the way that a person loves the specific civilization they have grown up inside and found beautiful, that has given them their language and their values and their understanding of what beauty is and what it means to live well. The Heian court in the third quarter of the 12th century was still producing the specific kind of beauty that had defined it for centuries, even as the political foundations of that beauty were becoming increasingly uncertain. The poetry was still written, the seasonal ceremonies were still observed, the particular quality of attention that the court had cultivated, the attention to the specific quality of light at specific times of day and specific times of year, to the precise emotional weight of specific combinations of color in the robes worn at specific occasions, to the way that a poem's imagery could evoke, in the right reader, an experience that was simultaneously aesthetic and emotional, and even, in some sense, philosophical. This attention was still being practiced, still being transmitted, still being recognized as the highest expression of what human cultivation could achieve. Shigemori was part of this. He wrote poetry. The records preserve examples of his poetry, verses that are not simply competent exercises in the standard forms, but that carry the specific quality that distinguishes poetry, that comes from genuine feeling, from poetry that comes from the obligation to produce it. He participated in the court's social world, the gatherings and the ceremonies, and the specific occasions on which the court's sense of itself as a civilization was expressed and renewed, not because participation was required of someone in his position, though it was, but because he found in this participation something genuine, the specific pleasure and the specific meaning that the court's world had to offer to people who were attuned to it. He was also, in his participation in the court world, something that his father was not quite able to be, genuinely liked. Kiyomori was respected, feared, and in certain quarters admired, but the court families, the ancient aristocratic houses that had managed the emperor's household for generations, regarded Kiyomori with a specific quality of wariness that was not entirely compatible with genuine affection. He was too direct. He was too obviously using them, the court families and their connections and their accumulated prestige, in the service of goals that were, in the end, the Taira's goals, not the court's. Shigemori was different. The court families found in Shigemori something they could respond to with something closer to genuine warmth, a man whose appreciation for the values they had spent their lives embodying was genuine, whose manners expressed an actual respect rather than a performed one, whose intelligence and cultivation were qualities they could recognize as shared rather than as instruments being deployed against them. This social position, Shigemori's genuine integration into the court world was not simply a personal achievement. It was a political asset of the First Order, one that Shigemori understood, and that distinguished his approach to the Taira's position from his father's. A warrior family that was genuinely integrated into the court world, that had members who were respected and liked by the ancient courthouses on the basis of genuine quality rather than simply feared because of military force, was a warrior family with a more secure foundation than one that was merely dominant. The court family's cooperation was more reliable, more genuinely useful, when it was given because of genuine respect rather than extracted because of fear. The emperor's own relationship to the Taira was more likely to be productive, less likely to produce the specific kind of resentment that power exercised without sensitivity always eventually produces, when the person representing the Taira in that relationship was someone the emperor and his household could genuinely deal with. Shigemori understood this. He embodied it, and in embodying it, he represented something that the Taira, with his father's approach, were increasingly failing to be: a family that deserved the position it held, not just a family that had the force to maintain it. There is a specific sadness in this, a sadness that this series wants to hold rather than pass over. Shigemori, in his genuine love of the court and his genuine integration into its world, was, in some sense, the answer to the question of what the Taira could have been, the version of the family that could have made the position Kiyomori had built into something lasting, something that the court families could have accepted rather than resented, something that the institutional structure of Heian Japan could have incorporated rather than eventually moving to displace. He was this answer, and he died at 34 in 1179, the year before the war began, before he had the opportunity to demonstrate what his version of Taira leadership might have produced. His death is what made everything else possible. This is what this series means when it says that this is the story of the son who tried to stop him. Shigemori did not have to stop his father through confrontation. He could have stopped him, eventually, simply by outliving him and providing as the successor a different kind of leadership. But he did not outlive him, and the world that might have been possible, the world in which Shigemori's values, rather than Kiyomori's overreach, had shaped the Taira's trajectory, remained a possibility that the course of actual events did not allow to become actual. The first major crisis that brought Shigemori's difference from his father into direct, public confrontation was the incident known as the Shishitani no Inbo, the conspiracy of Shishitani, in 1177. This event, and Shigemori's response to it, is one of the most revealing moments in the record of their relationship, the moment where the difference that this series has been describing in the abstract became, in the most concrete and consequential way, visible. The conspiracy of Shishitani was, in essence, a plot by a group of men connected to the retired emperor go-shirakawa, the same go-shirakawa who appears in this series in the context of Kenrei Moin's story, the retired emperor who was a permanent feature of the political landscape of this period, the man who had been managing Japanese politics for decades, and who remained, despite everything the Taira had done to limit his influence, a persistent source of opposition to Kiyomori's dominance. The plotters, meeting at a villa in the hills of Kyoto, in the area known as Shishitani, discussed the possibility of action against the Taira, of challenging Kiyomori's dominance in ways that went beyond the normal channels of political opposition. The plot was discovered. Its participants were arrested, punished, exiled, and in one case executed. Kiyomori's response to the discovery of the Shishigu conspiracy was, characteristically, the response of a man who saw in the conspiracy a threat that required the most decisive possible countermeasure. He moved to arrest go-shirakawa himself. This is the moment that forced Shigemori into direct confrontation with his father, and it is worth dwelling on what exactly Shigemori was objecting to, because the objection is not simply the objection of a cautious man who thought the action was tactically unwise. It was the objection of a man who believed the action was wrong. The retired emperor, in the political and cultural framework of Heian Japan, was not simply a powerful political figure whose power could be challenged or managed through the normal instruments of political and military force. He was the embodiment of imperial authority, the person in whose name the entire legitimacy of the court system rested, the symbolic center around which the entire apparatus of Japanese governance, however imperfect its actual functioning, was organized. To lay hands on the retired emperor, to arrest him, to use military force against his person, was not simply a political action with political consequences. It was a violation of the fundamental order of things, the order that the Taira had been claiming to serve, that the Taira's position depended on for its legitimacy. Shigemori said this to his father. The accounts of this confrontation describe Shigemori making the argument, directly and forcefully, that arresting go-shirakawa was not something the Taira should do, not because it was strategically inadvisable, though it was, but because it was wrong, because it violated obligations that the Taira owed to the imperial institution, obligations that were not negotiable and that could not be set aside because they were inconvenient. He argued with his father. He argued against a course of action that Kiyomori, by every indication, was determined to pursue, and he prevailed. Kiyomori backed down. Go-shirakawa was not arrested. The plan was abandoned. This outcome, the abandonment of the plan at Shigemori's insistence, is one of the most significant moments in the story of their relationship, because it demonstrates something that this series has not yet had occasion to demonstrate directly: the fact that Shigemori's influence over his father, the moral authority that Shigemori's position as the heir and his evident integrity had given him, was genuine, was real, was capable of producing actual changes in Kiyomori's behavior when Shigemori deployed it. Kiyomori listened to his son, not always, not in every case where Shigemori disagreed, but in this case, in the case of Go-shirakawa's arrest, Kiyomori backed down. This moment of backing down has been read differently by different historians and different readers of the Heike monogatari across the centuries. Some read it as evidence of genuine restraint in Kiyomori, the capacity, however rarely it was expressed, to hear the argument of someone he trusted and to change course. Others read it as evidence of something more pragmatic, the calculation that the specific action of arresting Go-shirakawa would produce consequences that Kiyomori, even in his anger, could see were worse than the alternative of backing down. Still others read it as evidence of Shigemori's specific influence, the kind of influence that a son can have over a father that is different from the influence that advisors or political allies have, more personal, more direct, operating through the accumulated weight of a relationship rather than through rational argument alone. All of these readings may be partially true. What is not in question is the outcome. Kiyomori did not arrest Go-shirakawa, and Shigemori's intervention was the reason. The larger significance of this moment is not simply what it tells us about the specific incident. It is what it tells us about the potential that existed in the relationship between Kiyomori and Shigemori for a different kind of Taira politics, the politics of a clan that was powerful enough to dominate but restrained enough to govern, that could use its power without the specific kind of overreach that ultimately produced the conditions for its own destruction. If Shigemori had lived, if he had been in a position to continue providing this kind of restraining influence on his father's worst impulses, if he had eventually succeeded to the clan's leadership and shaped its trajectory with the different values this series has been describing, the history of the Genpei period, might have been different in ways that are genuinely difficult to calculate, but Shigemori did not live, and the potential that the Shishitani incident demonstrated, the potential for a different kind of Taira leadership, died with him. The Shishitani incident was not an isolated confrontation. It was the most dramatic and the most clearly documented instance of the pattern that defined Shigemori's relationship with his father throughout the years of Kiyomori's ascendancy, the pattern of Shigemori opposing, arguing against, and sometimes preventing the specific excesses that Kiyomori's pursuit of power periodically produced. But the Shishitani incident was not the only such moment, and the argument about go-shirakawa was not the only argument. The relationship between Kiyomori and go-shirakawa was, throughout this period, one of the central dynamics of Japanese politics, a relationship between two men who were both extraordinarily capable, both extraordinarily determined, both pursuing goals that were, at certain points, compatible and, at other points, directly opposed. Kiyomori needed go-shirakawa, in the sense that the retired emperor's cooperation, or at least his acquiescence, was necessary for the legitimacy of the various arrangements through which Taira power expressed itself. Go-shirakawa needed Kiyomori, in the sense that the retired emperor's political survival, in a world where military force had become the ultimate arbiter of political outcomes, depended on his ability to navigate the relationship with the family that controlled that force. Both men understood this. Both men pursued their own interests within and around the constraints that the other's existence imposed. Shigemori's relationship with go-shirakawa was different from Kiyomori's, where Kiyomori's relationship with the retired emperor was fundamentally a relationship of management, of control, of the specific way that a very powerful person manages another very powerful person who is, nonetheless, less powerful than themselves. Shigemori's relationship with go-shirakawa was something closer to genuine respect, not uncritical respect. Go-shirakawa was a complicated man, whose own behavior was not always characterized by the restraint and the principled action that Shigemori valued. But go-shirakawa was also the retired emperor, the embodiment of the imperial institution, and Shigemori's respect for that institution was genuine, in the way this series has discussed, a respect that extended to the person who embodied it, even when that person's own behavior was not always easy to respect. The arguments between Kiyomori and Shigemori about how to treat go-shirakawa were not, in this context, simply arguments about tactics. They were arguments about what kind of family the Taira were, about what their power meant, and what it was for, and what obligations came with it. Kiyomori argued, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that power was its own justification, that a family with the Taira's military dominance could and should use that dominance to manage its political environment in whatever way served the family's interests, including by managing go-shirakawa in ways that the retired emperor himself found objectionable. Shigemori argued, with equal persistence, that this approach was both wrong and self-defeating. Wrong because it violated the obligations that gave the Taira's power its legitimacy, and self-defeating because a power that was resented rather than accepted was a power that was continuously generating the conditions of its own eventual challenge. These arguments went on across years. They were not always dramatic confrontations of the kind that the Shishitani incident represented. More often, they were the ongoing, recurring, lower-key expression of a fundamental disagreement that never resolved itself because neither man had the ability or the desire to simply abandon the position they held. Kiyomori was not going to stop being the man he was because his son disagreed with him. Shigemori was not going to stop being the man he was because his father's example pushed in a different direction. The disagreement was structural, rooted in the most fundamental differences of character and value between the two men, and it persisted because neither man was going to change who they were. What changed across these years was not the disagreement itself, but its consequences. Each instance where Kiyomori acted in the ways Shigemori opposed, each instance where the resentment of the court families and of go-shirakawa and of the broader establishment deepened, was an instance that confirmed Shigemori's understanding of where this was going, that built the case for the argument he had been making, that produced the specific accumulated damage to the Taira's legitimacy that would eventually create the conditions for the Genpei War. Shigemori saw this happening. He continued to argue against it, and the situation continued to develop in the direction he had been warning against, because his father's will, in the domain of political and military power, was stronger than his son's moral authority, and because the one resource Shigemori had that was capable of changing that balance, time, the time that would eventually have transferred the clan's leadership to him, was the resource he was, unknown to himself, running out of. There is a moment in the record of Shigemori's life that this series wants to spend particular time with, a moment that is not a dramatic confrontation, not a political crisis, not one of the specific incidents where Shigemori argued against his father and either prevailed or did not prevail. It is a quieter moment, or at least the account of it in the Heike Monogatari is presented with a quietness that the dramatic incidents do not have, and this quietness is part of what makes it significant. The moment is Shigemori's statement of the line he would not cross. The Heike Monogatari preserves, in its account of Shigemori, a statement that has been discussed and interpreted by readers for 8 centuries, a statement that is both simple and inexhaustible, that says something fundamental about who Shigemori was, and what he believed, and what he was willing to do, and what he was not willing to do. The statement, in its substance, is this. Shigemori said that he would not raise arms against the emperor or the retired emperor. He said this not as a conditional statement, not as an expression of his current reluctance that might change if circumstances changed, but as an absolute commitment, a declaration of what he was and what he was not, a line drawn in the most fundamental terms available. This statement needs to be understood in context. The political situation of the 1170s and 1180s was a situation in which the question of raising arms against the emperor or the retired emperor was not abstract. Kiyomori's management of go-shirakawa had, at various points, approached the line where management shaded into coercion, where the influence the Taira exercised over the imperial household shaded into the kind of direct control that would have required, if it were to be maintained against resistance, something close to force. The possibility of a direct confrontation between Taira military power and imperial resistance was not, in the political landscape of this period, something that existed only in the imagination. And Shigemori, stating that he would not be part of such a confrontation, was stating something that had direct relevance to the actual political situation he and his family were in. The statement also had a specific kind of moral weight in the context of the warrior culture of this period that it might not have in a different context. Warriors, in this culture, were defined by their loyalty, by the commitment to serve the Lord to whose service they had dedicated themselves, and by the willingness to act in the Lord's service even when that action was costly. Shigemori, in stating that there was something he would not do even in his father's service, even as the heir of the family whose head he would eventually become, was saying something that went against the warrior culture's deepest expectations of what a warrior was. He was saying that there were obligations that transcended loyalty to his lord, that the obligations he owed to the imperial institution were not simply subordinate to the obligations he owed to his father, that there was a hierarchy of obligations in which some things came before the family's interests, even when the family in question was his own. This was not a comfortable position to take, in a culture that did not have well-developed frameworks for the idea that a warrior's loyalty could be limited by higher obligations. It was not a comfortable position to take, in a family led by a man whose entire political career had been built on the expansion and the consolidation of the family's interests, who would have understood Shigemori's statement as a challenge to the absolute nature of that loyalty. Shigemori took it anyway. He drew the line. He said what he would not do. He placed himself, in the most public and the most permanent way available, on the side of the obligation to the imperial institution over the obligation to the family's immediate interests. What did this cost him? Within the family, it established a limit on how fully Shigemori could be relied upon for the things that Kiyomori, in his more extreme moments, might have wanted to rely on him for. It established Shigemori within the Taira clan's internal politics as a figure with his own principles, which is a different thing from being a figure with his own agenda, though the two can be confused. And in a political environment as charged as the Taira's internal dynamics in the 1170s, the confusion was probably not always avoided. But it also established something else, something that this series has been trying to articulate throughout these parts, about Shigemori, the specific kind of authority that comes from being known to have principles that cannot be bought or managed or overridden by the pressure of circumstances. Shigemori's word, because everyone who dealt with him understood that his word was backed by this kind of commitment, was worth more than the word of someone whose commitments were always potentially negotiable. This was the specific resource that Shigemori brought to the Taira's political position, the resource that his father, for all his political genius, could not provide, because Kiyomori's commitments were always, in the final analysis, in service of Kiyomori's goals. Shigemori's commitments were in service of something else, and this made him, in the specific ways that mattered, irreplaceable. The loneliness of Shigemori's position within the Taira clan is something that the records do not describe directly, in the way that they do not directly describe the internal experiences of most figures from this period. But the loneliness is there, present in the patterns of behavior and the specific choices that the records do preserve, in the quality of a position that was, in some fundamental sense, impossible to fully share with anyone else in the family. Kiyomori could not fully share it, because Kiyomori was the person whose choices were the primary source of what Shigemori was struggling with. The specific challenge that Shigemori's position required him to navigate, Munemori, Shigemori's younger brother, the person who would eventually inherit the clan's leadership after Shigemori's death, could not fully share it, because Munemori was, by the accounts of the period, not someone who was engaging with the same level of awareness about the family's situation and its implications that Shigemori was. The other brothers and cousins and members of the broader Taira family were similarly unavailable as genuine interlocutors for the specific quality of concern that Shigemori was carrying, because the specific quality of that concern required a combination of intelligence and principle and awareness of the larger stakes that was, it seems, specific to Shigemori within the family. He could share certain aspects of his position with figures outside the family, with the court families whose respect he had earned, with people in go-shirakawa's circle who understood and appreciated his different approach to the relationship between warrior power and court legitimacy. But these relationships, however genuine, had their own limitations, the limitation that the people he was most genuinely aligned with in terms of values were, in structural terms, the people whose interests were most directly in tension with his family's interests, and whose appreciation of Shigemori was, at least in part, an appreciation of the ways in which Shigemori could be a moderating influence on a family whose dominance they would have preferred not to be subject to. Shigemori understood this complexity. He navigated it as best he could, maintaining genuine relationships across the divide between the Taira and the court establishment, while also, when the situation required it, acting in the family's interests in ways that made clear he was, at the end, a Taira. This navigation, the attempt to be genuine with people across a fundamental structural divide, while also being faithful to the obligations that the divide imposed, is exhausting in ways that are difficult to sustain over long periods. The energy that is required to be, simultaneously, the son who is trying to restrain the father, the heir who is trying to demonstrate what a different kind of Taira leadership could look like, the court figure who has genuine relationships with people on the other side of the family's primary antagonism, and the warrior who, when push came to shove, was still a Taira and still understood what that meant, is the kind of energy that demands a great deal of the person who is trying to supply it. Shigemori supplied it. For years through the 1170s, as Kiyomori's methods became more extreme and the political situation became more fraught, Shigemori continued to occupy this impossible position, continued to be the moderating influence, the voice of restraint, the person in the clan who was willing to say what others were not willing to say. The cost of this, in terms of Shigemori's own well-being, was real. The accounts of his final years, the years leading up to his death in 1179, describe a man who was increasingly unwell, whose health had been deteriorating in ways that, in retrospect, make his death at 34 less surprising than it might otherwise seem. The specific nature of his illness is not described with enough precision in the surviving records to permit a modern medical interpretation. What the records convey is a pattern of declining health, of a man whose physical resources were, in the years before his death, becoming increasingly inadequate to the demands his situation was placing on them. There is, in this pattern, something that this series does not want to overstate, but also does not want to pass over entirely. The relationship between the kind of sustained psychological and moral burden that Shigemori was carrying, the burden of being the person in his family who saw most clearly what was wrong and most consistently bore the weight of trying to correct it, and the deterioration of his physical health, is the kind of relationship that neither historical research nor medical knowledge can establish with certainty. The connection between sustained stress, sustained moral burden, sustained effort to hold an impossible position, and physical health is something that the evidence of human experience across many cultures and many periods suggests is real, even when its specific mechanisms remain difficult to pin down. Shigemori was carrying a great deal. His health gave out at 34. Whether these facts are connected, and how, is something this series cannot say with certainty. But this series does not want to pretend the question is not there. The illness that would eventually kill Shigemori was present, in some form, in the years before his death. The years when the political situation he was navigating was reaching new levels of intensity, and the demands on him were, correspondingly, at their highest. The specific symptoms that the accounts describe, to the extent they describe symptoms at all, are consistent with the kind of chronic deterioration that could have a number of causes, physical, psychological, or some combination, and the accounts themselves are not detailed enough to permit the kind of retrospective diagnosis that might clarify what was actually happening to his body in these years. What the accounts are clear about is the progressive quality of his decline, the sense that Shigemori was, in the years leading up to 1179, a man whose vitality was diminishing, whose capacity to sustain the effort that his position required was becoming increasingly limited. In 1179, the same year as Shigemori's death, Kiyomori made one of the most consequential political moves of his career, the move that Shigemori had spent years trying to prevent, and that, with Shigemori no longer available to prevent it, Kiyomori was finally free to make. He arrested go-shirakawa, the retired emperor who had been the persistent source of political opposition to Taira dominance, who had been the focal point of the kind of resistance that Shigemori had been arguing, for years, needed to be managed through different means, was placed under arrest, deprived of his ability to exercise the functions of his office, removed as an active political actor. This is the action that Shigemori had stopped years before, at the time of the Shishitani incident. He was not alive to stop it this time. The timing of Kore, Kiyomori's arrest of go-shirakawa, following closely after Shigemori's death, is one of the most striking patterns in the political history of this period, a pattern that suggests, as clearly as any circumstantial evidence can suggest, that the restraint Kiyomori had exercised in this domain was, in significant part, the restraint imposed by Shigemori's presence and argument, and that the removal of that presence was the removal of the primary constraint on Kiyomori's worst impulses. This is not simply a claim about political cause and effect. It is also a claim about the relationship between personal character and historical outcomes, the claim that a specific person's presence in a specific position, with specific qualities and specific commitments, can make the difference between a set of events going one way and going another. Historical understanding is often skeptical of this kind of claim, preferring to explain historical outcomes in terms of structural forces, of large-scale social and economic and political patterns that would have produced similar outcomes regardless of which specific individuals happen to be in which specific positions. This skepticism contains something important, a reminder that individuals are shaped by structures, that the choices individuals make are constrained by contexts they did not create, that the story of history is not simply the story of individual choices accumulating. But the case of Shigemori and Kiyomori is one of those cases where the role of the specific individual seems genuinely significant, where the difference between the outcomes that occurred and the outcomes that might have occurred if Shigemori had lived seems plausibly attributable, at least in part, to the difference that this specific person's presence would have made. Kiyomori, without Shigemori, arrested go-shirakawa. What would Kiyomori have done, with Shigemori still present, still arguing, still exercising the specific restraining influence that he had exercised in the Shishitani incident and in the years of ongoing argument about how to manage the relationship with the imperial household? The honest answer is that we cannot know. Kiyomori was not simply a man who did what his son told him to do, who was entirely subject to Shigemori's influence. He was a man of extraordinary will and extraordinary ambition, who, in the final analysis, did what he was going to do. But he had also, in at least one documented case, not done what he was going to do, because Shigemori had argued against it. This is the question that Shigemori's death leaves open, the question that this series wants to sit with rather than resolve, because the honest response to it is not a resolution, but a recognition of contingency, of the specific way that history depends on the specific people who are in specific positions at specific moments, and of how different things might have been if the people had been different, or if the same people had had more time. Shigemori was ill. He was ill in the years when the political situation was reaching the point of no return. He died before the point of no return was reached, and without him, the point of no return was reached, in the specific form of Kiyomori's arrest of go-shirakawa, the action that Shigemori had spent years preventing, the action that, once taken, accelerated the deterioration of the Taira's political position in ways that could not be reversed. Shigemori was ill. This is the simple fact. The implications of that simple fact are not simple at all. In the years before his death, as his health declined and the political situation continued to develop in the directions he had been warning against, Shigemori made a pilgrimage to Kumano. This series has encountered Kumano before, in the story of Kiyomori, who traveled there in the months after Danura, heading toward Nachi and the sea, and the ending he chose there. Kumano, for Shigemori, represented something different, the same sacred landscape, the same deep mountains of the Kii Peninsula, the same associations with the boundary between the ordinary world and the other world that lay beyond it, but visited in different circumstances and with different purposes. Shigemori's pilgrimage to Kumano was a religious journey, in the specific sense that the major shrines and temples of Kumano were destinations for pilgrimage in the religious culture of the period, places where the journey itself, the physical effort of traveling through the mountains, was understood as part of the devotional act, where the specific landscape, with its waterfalls and its ancient forests and its particular quality of sacred wildness, created conditions for a kind of experience that ordinary life in the capital did not provide. Emperors had made this pilgrimage. Aristocrats had made it. The retired emperor Go-shirakawa himself was known for his devotion to Kumano, for the many times he had made the journey to these mountains. Shigemori's pilgrimage placed him within this tradition, the tradition of powerful and cultivated people who sought, in the specific landscape of Kumano, something that power and cultivation did not by themselves provide. What Shigemori prayed for at Kumano is recorded in the accounts of this period with a specificity that the Heike Monogatari does not always provide for the inner lives of its figures. He prayed for his own death, not in the sense of seeking it, not in the sense of wanting to die, but in the specific and poignant sense of a man who had looked at the situation his family and his country were in, who had understood what his own continued presence meant and what his death would mean, and who had concluded that if his death was necessary to prevent his father from doing something worse, then his death was what he would pray for. This prayer, the prayer of a son who believes that his own death might be preferable to the alternative, deserves to be held with the attention it demands. It is not a prayer of despair, not the prayer of a man who has given up on the world and wishes to leave it. It is something stranger and more difficult, the prayer of a man who has thought carefully about the relationship between his life and the larger situation, and who has concluded that there is a specific way in which his death, by removing him as a constraint on his father, would make things worse, and a different way in which his death, by removing him as a burden and a distraction, would allow the situation to resolve in a different direction. The logic of the prayer requires some unpacking. Shigemori, in his role as the heir, was, in a sense, the person around whom Kiyomori's worst impulses were currently organized, the person whose presence required Kiyomori to at least consider the restraining argument, whose arguments gave the opposition to Kiyomori's excesses a voice within the family that it would not otherwise have. If Shigemori died, this restraining influence would be removed. This seems like it would make things worse, and in one sense it would. But Shigemori may also have been thinking about something else, about the possibility that the situation was already past the point where his restraining influence could make the decisive difference, that the momentum of Kiyomori's ambitions had already built to the point where no amount of internal opposition could redirect it, and that, in this context, his continued presence was simply delaying an inevitable confrontation while imposing on his own health a burden that would, in any case, eventually overcome it. If the situation was already past saving, in other words, perhaps the best that could be hoped for, was that the consequences of Kiyomori's overreach would arrive quickly and produce in their arrival the kind of correction that Shigemori's living presence had been failing to produce. This is a bleak analysis. It is the analysis of a man who had been watching and arguing and being largely unsuccessful, who had seen the situation develop despite his best efforts, and who had concluded, in the sacred landscape of Kumano, that he might have reached the limit of what his efforts could accomplish. Shigemori prayed for his own death. He was, in this prayer, accepting a conclusion that his years of effort had led him to. The prayer was answered. He died, the following year, in 1179. Whether the answer was what he had hoped, whether the manner in which things unfolded after his death, Kiyomori's arrest of go-shirakawa, the Genpei War, the eventual destruction of everything the family had built, was the kind of correction he had been hoping the situation might produce in his absence, is a question that this series cannot answer with any certainty. What is clear is that he was not there for it. He prayed to leave. He left. The prayer at Kumano sits at the center of Shigemori's story, the moment that reveals, more directly than any of the political confrontations or the documented arguments, something essential about how Shigemori understood his own situation and his own role within it. It sits at the center because it is, in some sense, the opposite of everything that the warrior culture and the political culture of this period valued. Prayers for longevity were common. Prayers for success were common. Prayers for the health of one's family, for the flourishing of one's cause, for victory in the competitions and the conflicts that structured political and military life. These were the normal content of the religious practices that the people of this period engaged in. Prayers for one's own death were something else. In the religious framework of the period, specifically within the Buddhist traditions that were woven through every level of Heian culture, the acceptance of death, the willingness to release attachment to continued existence, was understood as a high spiritual achievement, the expression of a developed understanding of impermanence and of the suffering that comes from resistance to impermanence. But this is not quite what Shigemori's prayer was, or not simply what it was. Shigemori was not praying for his own death as the expression of spiritual detachment, as the demonstration of a realized wisdom about the nature of existence. He was praying for his own death because he believed it might be better for the people and the institutions he cared about than his continued life. This is a different thing, a thing that contains within it both the spiritual acceptance and something more immediately practical, the practical judgment of a man who had assessed the situation and concluded that his death was, in some sense, the most useful thing he could contribute at this stage. The contrast with other figures in this series is instructive here. Tomonori also accepted death at Dan Nura, the deliberate prepared ending with the anchors. But Tomonori's acceptance was the acceptance of a man who had seen a situation reach its final stage, and who was responding to that finality with the clarity that had defined him throughout. Nidono's taking of the emperor into the sea was an act that combined the acceptance of death with the specific decision about how the emperor should die, and where and in what circumstances. These acts were in response to something that had already happened, to the final stage of a situation that had run its course. Shigemori's prayer was different, a prayer made while the situation was still unfolding, while the worst outcomes were still in the future, while, in the most direct sense, there was still something to be lost and something to be done. To pray for your own death while there is still something to be done is an act of a specific kind of faith, or a specific kind of despair, or some combination of both that is difficult to separate into its constituent parts. It is an act of faith, in the sense that it requires a belief that the unfolding of events, without your presence and your efforts, will produce something that your presence and your efforts cannot produce, that there is a larger process at work whose course is better served by your absence than by your continued intervention. It is also an act of despair, in the sense that it reflects the conclusion that your efforts have reached their limit, that what you have been trying to do is not working and is not going to work, that the situation has moved beyond the reach of the specific kind of influence you are capable of exercising. Shigemori's prayer at Kumano was both of these things, a faith that the larger situation would resolve itself, and a despair that his own role in shaping that resolution had been exhausted. What the prayer also was, and this is perhaps the aspect of it that this series finds most difficult to hold, is an act of love. A son who prays for his own death because he believes it will be better for the people and the institutions he loves is performing a specific kind of love, the love that is willing to remove itself from the equation, if removing itself from the equation serves those who are loved. This is not a love that is easy to recognize as love, because love in the ordinary sense is a presence, an attachment, a desire for the continuation of the beloved's life and one's own relationship to it. Shigemori's love in this prayer was a departure, a relinquishment, the specific act of someone who loves enough to remove the constraint that their love imposes, to stop being the person whose presence requires the father to at least hear the argument, because hearing the argument is not producing the change, and the effort of making it is consuming the son's remaining vitality. He prayed to leave. He loved his father. These were not contradictions. They were, in the specific circumstances of this specific relationship, the same thing. Taira no Shigemori died in the 8th month of 1179. He was 34 years old. This fact, the specific age, needs to be held alongside everything else this series has discussed about him, because 34 is not old, and the person who died at 34 was not the person that Shigemori's capabilities and his values and his specific place within the Taira clan story suggested he would become. 34 is the age of someone who is still, in the fullest sense, becoming, still in the process of learning what his qualities, his intelligence, and his principle and his genuine cultivation could accomplish when given the time and the circumstances to be fully deployed. The accounts of his death describe it without the kind of dramatic detail that the Heike Monogatari gives to other significant deaths in the clan's story. There is no battle. There is no final confrontation. There is no moment of choice, as there is for Tomonori, or for Koromori, or for Nidono. There is illness, and then death, in the way that deaths from illness come, without the specific drama that the warrior culture expected of a warrior's death, without the possibility of facing the end with the specific kind of bearing that the culture valued and rewarded. Shigemori died in his bed, or at least without a sword in his hand, which was not how the Taira's deaths were supposed to go, in the understanding of the warrior culture that the family represented. The timing of his death, in relation to the events that followed it, has already been noted in this series. Kiyomori's arrest of go-shirakawa came in the same year as Shigemori's death, in the 11th month, 3 months after Shigemori died. This is not a coincidence. The Heike Monogatari does not suggest it is a coincidence. The tradition of reading this story has not, across 8 centuries, treated it as a coincidence. The most natural reading, the reading that the sequence of events almost demands, is that these two events are connected, that the arrest of go-shirakawa happened in 1179, after years of not happening, because the person who had been preventing it died in 1179. This reading has something to be said for it and something to be said against it. In favor of it is the simple fact of the sequence, the death in the 8th month and the arrest in the 11th month, and the record that Shigemori had, on at least one previous occasion, prevented exactly this kind of action. Against it is the point that Kiyomori was a complex figure whose decisions were shaped by many factors beyond his son's influence, and that the arrest of go-shirakawa may have been, in part, the product of specific political developments in the late months of 1179 that are independent of Shigemori's death. But the tradition is probably right in its instinct that the connection is real, not in the simple sense that Shigemori's death was the direct and sole cause of Kiyomori's arrest of go-shirakawa, but in the larger sense that Shigemori's presence had been one of the significant constraints on Kiyomori's behavior in this domain, and that the removal of that constraint, whatever other factors may also have been in play, was part of the context within which the arrest became possible. Kiyomori, hearing of his son's death, is described in the accounts with a grief that the records suggest was genuine. Whatever the limitations of their relationship, whatever the recurring disagreements and the specific tensions that had characterized their interactions across the years, Kiyomori loved his son. The records give him grief that is not performed, not the formal expression of mourning that the culture required from a father who had lost a son, but something more direct and more personal, the grief of a man who understood, even if he did not articulate it in the specific terms that this series has been using, what he had lost. He had lost the person who saw him most clearly. He had lost the person whose opposition was the most honest testimony to his own excesses. He had lost the person whose presence kept him, in however limited a way, from the worst of what he was capable of. He grieved, and then, 3 months later, he arrested go-shirakawa. Shigemori was 34. His son Koromori was 11 or 12 when his father died. Munemori, who would inherit the clan's leadership, was several years older. These facts are worth holding, because they represent the specific human aftermath of Shigemori's death, the children who lost a father and the brother who gained, earlier than anyone had expected, a responsibility for which he was, as this series has discussed, not fully prepared. His death was not an abstraction. It was the death of a father and a brother and a son, a death that left specific people in specific circumstances that would shape the rest of their lives, including the circumstances that this series has already explored from Koromori's and Munemori's perspectives. Shigemori was 34. The consequences of his being 34 when he died, rather than 60 or 65, when his death would have been the natural conclusion of a full life, played out across the next 6 years of Japanese history in ways that this series has been tracing from many different angles. What changed when Shigemori died? This is the question that this series wants to address directly, not in the abstract way that historical analysis sometimes addresses questions of causation, but in the specific, concrete way that asks what was different in the world that followed Shigemori's death from the world that might have existed if he had lived. The most immediate change was the one already noted, Kiyomori's arrest of go-shirakawa in the same year. This action, which this series has discussed in several contexts, had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate political situation. It confirmed, for the court families who had been watching Kiyomori's management of the imperial household with increasing alarm, that the restraints on Kiyomori's behavior that had existed were no longer in place. It confirmed, for go-shirakawa himself, that the approach of managing his relationship with Kiyomori through the kinds of subtle political maneuvering that the court had developed for exactly these situations was no longer adequate to the circumstances. And it confirmed, for the forces in the eastern provinces who were watching these events and assessing when and how to move, that the political situation in the capital was developing in ways that might, at some point, make rebellion viable. The second change was the succession. Without Shigemori, the heir was Munemori, and this series has discussed at length what that meant for the Taira clan's capacity to navigate the crisis that was coming. Munemori was not Shigemori. Munemori did not have Shigemori's intelligence or his principle or his genuine integration into the court world or his specific influence over Kiyomori. Munemori was the heir by default, the consequence of the death of the person who had been prepared to be the heir, and the constraints of this default would shape the Taira's behavior in the crisis years in ways that this series has already explored. The third change was subtler but perhaps more significant: the moral authority of the Taira's position, the claim that the clan made, explicitly or implicitly, to be something more than simply the most powerful military family in Japan, to be a family whose power served legitimate purposes and was exercised with genuine regard for the obligations of service, was not something that could be maintained by a family that had just arrested the retired emperor, and that was now led, in succession from the man who had built this claim, by a man who could not himself make this claim. Shigemori had been the embodiment of this moral authority within the family. He had been, in his genuine love of the court, and his genuine commitment to the obligations of service, the evidence that the Taira could be something more than what critics had always suspected they were. Without him, this evidence was no longer available. The Taira were what they were, without the complication that Shigemori's presence had introduced, the complication of a family that might, under a different kind of leadership, have become something more compatible with the legitimacy claims that Japanese political culture required. The fourth change was Koromori. Koromori, as this series has described, grew up without his father, grew up as the eldest son of a man who had died young, in circumstances that shaped Koromori's sense of his own position within the family and his own obligations as the heir of a man who had been something specific, something that the family needed and could no longer provide. The sense of a father he had not had enough time with, the sense of a legacy he was expected to carry, but that he had not had long enough to fully understand, is part of what shaped him into the person he became, the person who could not be what the family needed, who left Yashima before the end, who prayed at Kumano, like his father had prayed at Kumano, and entered the sea at Nachi. These connections between Shigemori's death and the subsequent stories that this series has already told, Koromori and Munemori and the others, are not simply biographical coincidences. They are the specific human consequences of a specific death at a specific moment, the ripples that spread outward from the loss of a person who was, in the most direct terms, the best that the Taira had to offer, and whose death left a family and a political situation without the one resource that might have made a different kind of ending possible. Shigemori died at 34. What followed was what followed, and everything that followed, the war, the defeats, the desperate retreat, the destruction at Dan Nora, the captivities and the executions and the long aftermath that this series has been exploring from so many different angles, all of it contains, somewhere in its background, the absence that Shigemori's death created, the specific gap that his 34 years were not enough to fill. The what-if question. History does not permit what-if questions to be answered with certainty, and historians are generally, and rightly, cautious about entertaining them too seriously, because the variables are too many and too complex, because the world is not a controlled experiment where you can change one factor and observe the result, because the specific contingencies that shape the actual course of events are not separable from the larger patterns that would have continued to operate in any alternative scenario. This series understands all of this. This series is going to ask the what-if question anyway, because Shigemori's story demands it, because the specific nature of what was lost when he died makes the question unavoidable for anyone who has spent time with this story. What if Shigemori had lived? Not in the specific sense of imagining a single alternative where he did not get sick at 34 and lived for another 30 years and everything worked out. Life is not like that, and history is not like that, and this series is not going to pretend otherwise. But in the more modest sense of asking what his presence might have changed in the specific years that immediately followed his death, the years when the decisions that led to the Genpei War were being made, when the trajectory that produced Don Nora was being set. If Shigemori had lived and remained healthy through the late 1170s and into the 1180s, the most immediate likely difference is the one already noted: Kiyomori's arrest of go-shirakawa in November 1179 probably does not happen, or happens in a different form, or is reversed more quickly if it does happen. This matters, because the arrest of go-shirakawa was one of the events that most directly accelerated the deterioration of the Taira's political legitimacy, that confirmed for the court families and for the opposition that Kiyomori was not going to be restrained by any consideration except his own interests. A Taira leadership that had not taken this step, that had managed its relationship with go-shirakawa through the more careful approach that Shigemori had always advocated, would have had a different relationship with the court establishment as the larger crisis developed. Beyond this specific issue, Shigemori's continued presence would have meant continued pressure on the clan's internal decision-making in the direction of restraint, of the kind of governance that takes the clan's legitimacy seriously as something that needs to be maintained rather than simply assumed. This does not mean that the tensions between the Taira and the Minamoto, between the Taira's dominance and the resentments that dominance had generated in the eastern provinces, would have simply disappeared. The structural forces that produced the Genpei War were real and would have continued to operate regardless of whether Shigemori was alive to restrain specific manifestations of his father's overreach. But structural forces operate through specific events and specific decisions, and specific events and specific decisions are shaped by the specific people who are making them. Shigemori's presence might not have prevented the Genpei War. It might have produced a Genpei War that was smaller, or that started later, or that ended differently, one in which the Taira's legitimacy had been better maintained, and their political foundation was therefore stronger. The most speculative question is the question of succession. If Shigemori had lived, he would eventually have become the head of the Taira clan after Kiyomori's death in 1181, and a Taira clan led by Shigemori would have been a fundamentally different political entity from the Taira clan led by Mune-mori, different in the ways that this series has discussed across many parts, different in its relationship to the court establishment, different in its capacity to exercise genuine leadership rather than simply formal authority, different in its ability to make the kinds of decisions that the crisis of the Genpei War required. Could Shigemori have navigated the crisis in a way that preserved the Taira, or at least produced a less catastrophic outcome than the one that actually occurred? This is impossible to know. The Minamoto forces, under Yoshitsune's genius, were formidable, and the military trajectory of the war might have been difficult to change regardless of the quality of Taira leadership. But the political dimension of the war, the question of legitimacy, and of which side the court establishment and the provincial families would ultimately support, was more open, and a Taira clan with Shigemori's kind of genuine integration into the court world at its head might have been able to compete in this dimension more effectively than Mune-mori's clan did. These questions will never be answered. Shigemori died at 34. The what-if remains what it is, a question that history poses and cannot resolve. But the asking of the question is itself significant, because it is a testimony to what was lost, a recognition that the person who died at 34 was not simply a life that ended prematurely, but a possibility that ended with it, a different trajectory that was foreclosed not by the large forces of history alone, but by the specific, contingent, ultimately unremarkable fact of a man getting sick and dying before he had the time to do what he might have done. Shigemori died. History went the way it went, and in the specific way that these two facts are connected, there is something worth mourning that is different from, and in addition to, the mourning for the specific person who died. This series began by saying that this story is different from the others. The other stories in this series have been stories about people who were shaped by the world Kiyomori made, who lived inside it, who were formed by it, who struggled with it, who were eventually destroyed by its collapse. This story is about the one person within the Taira clan who tried to shape the world differently, who argued, consistently and at cost to himself, for a different kind of power, a different kind of leadership, a different relationship between the family's strength and the obligations that strength imposed. Shigemori did not succeed. The world he tried to create, the world of a Taira that governed rather than dominated, that served rather than managed, that understood its power as something that came with obligations rather than simply with privileges, was not the world that his father built, and was not the world that survived Kiyomori's death. The world that survived was the world this series has been exploring from so many other perspectives, the world of the retreat and the battles and the desperate positions and the final catastrophe at Dan-nura, the world in which the Taira's power, built without adequate foundations in legitimate service, collapsed when the challenge to it came. Shigemori was not there for this collapse. He died before it began. But his influence on this series is, in some sense, the most pervasive of any figure this series has explored, because every other story this series has told has been shaped, in some way, by the absence of what Shigemori might have provided. Kenreimo-in went into the sea at Dan-nura because the world her father had built, without the kind of correction that Shigemori had been advocating, collapsed in a way that left her no other choice. Shigehira burned the Daibutsu because he was given a command by a family that was already, by 1180, operating without the restraining influence that Shigemori had provided while he lived. Tomonori watched the empire fall, piece by piece, presiding over the tactical intelligence of a family that lacked, at the level of strategic leadership, the quality that Shigemori would have brought. Munemori did not choose at Dan-nura in part because he had never had the example of Shigemori's kind of leadership close enough to him, for long enough, to understand what it looked like to make the hard choices. Koromori left his wife and children and walked toward Nachi, following a path that his own father might have described, if Shigemori had lived long enough to describe anything, as the only path available when the world you were born into does not match who you actually are. This is not to say that everything that happened in the Genpei War, and everything that happened to these figures, was Shigemori's fault for dying. That would be to make the what if question too literal, to collapse the distinction between the absence of a person and the direct causation of the events that followed that absence. Shigemori's death was not the cause of the Genpei War. It was not the cause of Dan-nura, or of Shigehira's capture at Ichinotani, or of Tomonori's anchors, or of Munemori's absence of choice, but it was part of the context within which all of these things happened, and the specific quality of that context, the quality of a family that was without its best representative when the worst challenge it had ever faced arrived, is part of what makes the story of the Taira the story it is. The Heike Monogatari, in how it handles Shigemori, gives him a specific quality that it gives to very few other figures. It gives him the quality of someone who was right and who was not heeded, and who died before he had the opportunity to demonstrate what being right, and having the power to act on being right, might have produced. This is a specific kind of tragedy, different from the tragedy of Atsumori, who was cut off at 16 before he had time to become what he might have been. Different from the tragedy of Ken Reimoin, whose survival of Dan Nora was a survival into loss. Different from the tragedy of Tomonori, whose clear-sightedness saw the ending coming and could not prevent it. Shigemori's tragedy is the tragedy of someone who had the right answers and not enough time to implement them, who was, in the specific years when his qualities were most needed, being consumed by illness while the situation he had been trying to shape was moving beyond the reach of his influence. He tried. This is the simplest thing that can be said about Shigemori, and it is, in a story full of figures who did not try, or who tried and failed for different reasons, or who were not in a position to try, something worth saying. He tried to be different from his father in the ways that mattered. He tried to use the intelligence and the principle and the genuine cultivation that the Heian world had given him in the service of a different kind of Taira leadership. He tried to argue against the overreach that he understood was creating the conditions for catastrophe. He tried to stop the things that could be stopped, and succeeded, in at least one case, in stopping them. He tried, even at the end, even when his health was failing and his influence was diminishing, to find some way to use his own situation in service of the values he had always held, and what he arrived at was the prayer at Kumano, the acceptance that his departure was the last thing he had to offer. He tried. He died at 34. The world went the way it went, but the trying was real. And in a story about the end of a world, the presence of someone who tried, genuinely and at cost to himself, to prevent that end, is not a small thing. It is, in some ways, the most important thing.